Freddie Mercury left Brian May a personal letter to be opened after the funeral. Brian May has never described what was in it. He has said it changed one thing. It is late November 1991. A few days have passed since the funeral. You are Brian May. You have spent the week saying the things people say. You have stood beside Roger Taylor at a graveside whose exact location belongs to someone else now. You have gone home each night to a house that is quieter than it used to be, because the man who filled every room he was ever in is no longer in any of them. And on your desk, or in a drawer, or handed to you by someone in the inner circle who had been keeping it there, is an envelope. Your name on the front, in handwriting you would know anywhere. Inside, words Freddie Mercury wrote knowing you would only read them once he was already gone. You open it. You read it once. You read it again. And something in you that had already decided the band was finished, that you and Roger had already agreed if one of us goes, that's it, something in that decision quietly comes undone. Now, open your eyes. Brian May has spoken for over 30 years about nearly everything Freddie Mercury ever said to him. He has never once described what was written on that page. He has said only that it changed one thing. What Brian May has confirmed, in interviews given decades apart, but always in the same careful shape, is this: the surviving members of Queen had an old agreement among themselves, informal. Never written down as far as anyone knows, but real enough that May has referenced it more than once. If one of us goes, that's it. The band ends. No replacement. No continuation. No pretending the gap could be filled. When Freddie Mercury died on November 24, 1991, Brian May and Roger Taylor went out, in May's own words, grieving to the max, telling people and telling each other that it was over. For some period after that, by his own account, they meant it completely. And yet Freddie Mercury, in his final months, had already been doing something that ran directly against that old pact, almost as if he had decided, on his own, that the agreement no longer applied to him. He had been telling Brian May, in the studio, near the very end, I'm not going to be here long. Just give me stuff to sing. Write me stuff on the back of a cigarette packet, whatever, just give me stuff. Brian May has called this, in his own words, a gift. Not a letter exactly, at least. Not in any account he has given on record. A gift. Left behind in the form of material. Vocal takes, recorded for songs the band hadn't finished. Ideas sketched and abandoned mid-session. Fragments Freddie pushed through despite a body that was failing him more each week. Because he had apparently understood something the other two had not yet let themselves consider, that the band might need a way to keep existing without him, and that the only way he could give them that was to leave behind enough of himself, on tape, that there would be something to build from. These fragments became the foundation of Made in Heaven, released in 1995, assembled from sessions Freddie had pushed through specifically, as May has put it, knowing he was running out of time. This is the gift everyone now knows about. It is generous, well documented, often discussed. It is not, by Brian May's own careful phrasing in separate, much rarer remarks. The only thing Freddie Mercury left him. It is not, by Brian May's own careful phrasing in separate, much rarer remarks. The only thing Freddie Mercury left him, in at least one account brief, never expanded upon, never repeated with the same specificity, since Brian May has referred to something more personal than studio tape. Something with his name on it specifically, rather than the band's name collectively. Something that did not arrive as music, but as words, intended for him alone, to be read only after the funeral had already happened, after the public grieving had already begun, after the door on Freddie Mercury's physical presence had already and permanently closed. He has never called it a letter outright in any interview that has surfaced widely. He has alluded to its existence in language careful enough that it could mean several things, and every time the subject edges close to specificity, May redirects back to the studio tape, back to the pact about ending the band, back to the safer, better documented gift that everyone already knows the shape of. If one of us goes, that's it.This was, by Brian May's own account, a real agreement among the three remaining members during Freddie's lifetime, the specific kind of pact musicians make when they cannot yet imagine actually needing to honor it. When the moment came, May and Taylor initially treated the pact as binding. They grieved. They said it was over. They meant it. For a period that May has described as quite a long time. And then, eventually, they made Made in Heaven anyway, using Freddie's own recorded gift, the material he'd left specifically so they could. This already represents one reversal of the original pact, and it is the reversal most people know about, because the album exists, because it sold millions of copies, because its existence has been explained in interview after interview as an act of honoring Freddie's wishes rather than breaking their own promise to each other. But Brian May has indicated, however briefly, that something happened before that reversal, something that happened in the days immediately after the funeral, before Made in Heaven was even a concept. That began softening his certainty that the band was finished. The timing matters here in a way that is easy to miss. Freddie Mercury died on November 24, 1991. He was cremated at West London Crematorium on November 27th. Whatever instructions existed for anything to be given to Brian May, specifically separate from the studio tapes, separate from anything connected to the music itself, would have had to be arranged while Freddie was still alive by someone he trusted to deliver it at the correct moment. This is consistent with everything known about how Freddie Mercury handled his own final arrangements. He bought houses for people he loved without telling them in advance. He arranged a painting wrapped in a pillowcase to arrive at Peter Freestone's door 6 weeks after his death, with a note signed from one of their private nicknames to the other. He was, by every account from people who were close to him, a person who planned the gestures of his own ending with the same care he brought to staging a Queen video quietly, in advance, designed to land at a specific moment for a specific person, with no fanfare and no warning. He was, by every account from people who were close to him, a person who planned the gestures of his own ending with the same care he brought to staging a Queen video quietly, in advance, designed to land at a specific moment for a specific person, with no fanfare and no warning. If this same instinct extended to something for Brian May, specifically words rather than tape, intended to be read only once the funeral had already happened, once the rawest week of public grief had already passed, it would fit a pattern Freddie Mercury demonstrated repeatedly in his final months. He thought about timing. He thought about what people would need and exactly when they would need it. A gift handed over immediately, in the chaos of the death itself, might have been unread, unprocessed, lost in everything else demanding attention that week. A gift that arrived after the funeral, after the public ceremony was complete, after Brian May had already stood at a graveside and already begun the work of imagining a life in a band without Freddie in it, would land instead in the specific quiet that follows a funeral, when the busyness ends and the actual absence finally has room to be felt. Brian May has described the period immediately following Freddie's death in fragments scattered across many different interviews, never assembled into one complete account. He has said that he and Roger Taylor went out grieving to the max. He has said they agreed it was over, that they didn't even want to talk about it for quite a long time. He has described separately the broader shock of those weeks, the press outside the gates, the public statement, the funeral itself, the strange experience of mourning someone whose private life had just become, almost overnight, the subject of global public interest in a way it had specifically avoided for years. What he has not done, in any account that has surfaced, is walk a listener through the literal sequence of those first days after the funeral, hour by hour. There is a gap in the public record exactly where a private moment, receiving something, reading it, sitting with it would naturally fall, if such a moment existed. The absence of detail is not proof, but the shape of the silence is consistent with something specific being deliberately left out. Brian May has used a particular phrase in at least one interview to describe the effect of whatever he received. He has said that it changed one thing, not his grief. He has been clear elsewhere that the grief did not lessen, that losing Freddie remained, by his own later description, like losing a brother, an ongoing weight, rather than a problem that resolved. Not his understanding of who Freddie was, May has spent decades affirming the same character he always described: the generosity, the refusal of self-pity, the discipline. The one thing that changed, by every reasonable reading of the surrounding context, appears to be the pact. If we wake up the day after and we haven't been there, we're going to be pretty sad. This is the sentence Brian May used to talk Freddie into doing Live Aid in 1985. When Freddie himself was the reluctant one. It is not impossible that whatever Freddie Mercury left behind for Brian May after the funeral was, in its own way, the same argument turned back around a final piece of persuasion, aimed not at getting onto a stage, but at not letting the music stop entirely. A final piece of persuasion, aimed not at getting onto a stage, but at not letting the music stop entirely. If this is even approximately what happened, it would explain something that has otherwise required no explanation at all in the official version of events: why two men who had just told the world and told each other that the band was finished ended up 4 years later assembling an entire album from Freddie's leftover vocal takes, releasing it to enormous commercial and emotional success, and continuing under the Queen name in some form for the rest of their working lives, eventually touring arenas with Adam Lambert decades later. The official explanation has always been the studio tapes themselves, Freddie's recorded gift, sitting there, demanding eventually to be used. But tapes do not argue. Tapes do not change minds. Something changed Brian May's mind specifically, by his own account. And tape recordings that already existed before the funeral do not fit the timeline of a change that, by his own phrasing, happened to him personally, privately, in a way he has chosen not to fully describe. There are several reasons a person keeps a letter like this private, and none of them require anything scandalous to be true. The most obvious is the simplest. It was written for one person, by someone who has since died, and reading it aloud to journalists would convert a private final message into public content. The exact transformation Peter Freestone has said Freddie spent his whole adult life trying to manage and limit. A second possibility is that the letter's contents are, in their specifics, too ordinary to survive translation into a magazine quote, that whatever made it powerful was its handwriting, its timing, the fact of its existence at all, rather than any particular sentence that would sound profound stripped of context. A third possibility, harder to prove but consistent with how grief actually works, is that Brian May simply does not want to share it, full stop, with no further justification required, and that 35 years of journalists accepting this boundary is itself a quiet testament to how clearly he has drawn it. If such a letter exists, someone had to carry it from Freddie Mercury's final arrangements into Brian May's hands at the correct moment. Peter Freestone managed Freddie's correspondence for 12 years and has described arranging at least one similarly timed gift, the painting that arrived at his own door, wrapped in a pillowcase 6 weeks after the funeral. With a note Freddie had prepared in advance, Mary Austin inherited Garden Lodge, and by her own account, spent years afterward handling the practical aftermath of Freddie's most private instructions, including ones nobody else was told about, either of them, or someone else entirely within the small circle who managed Freddie's final weeks, could plausibly have been the one entrusted with an envelope marked simply, "For Brian, after," None of them has ever confirmed this specific detail publicly, but the infrastructure for exactly this kind of quiet, precisely timed delivery clearly existed around Freddie Mercury in his last months, because it has already been documented happening for at least one other person in his life. But the infrastructure for exactly this kind of quiet, precisely timed delivery clearly existed around Freddie Mercury in his last months, because it has already been documented happening for at least one other person in his life. Brian May has spent 35 years being one of the most forthcoming public figures connected to Freddie Mercury's memory interviews, documentaries, tribute concerts. A Mercury Phoenix Trust built specifically to keep the conversation about AIDS and about Freddie alive. He has described the foot, the apology, the final visit, the curtains open to the garden, the cigarette packet songwriting, the pact about ending the band. He has filled almost every room in this story with detail. And in the middle of all that openness sits one closed door, opened only enough to confirm that something is behind it, never opened further. He has said it changed one thing. He has never said what the thing inside actually said. November 27th, 1991, a funeral.days pass, an envelope, Brian May's name, on the front, inside. Words from someone who is already gone, he reads it once, he reads it again. Something that had already been decided: the band is finished. That's it. We agreed quietly comes undone. He has never said what the letter said. He has said only this: it changed one thing. 4 years later, made in heaven. Assembled from tape Freddie left behind, on purpose. A gift everyone knows about. A second gift, smaller, private, addressed to one name, only known only by its effect, never by its words. Brian May kept playing. Brian May kept the band's name alive for 35 more years. Somewhere in a drawer, or in a box, or nowhere physical at all anymore, just in memory, there is a page that did that. He has never shown it to anyone. He never will. That was always the point of it.